Welcome to today's chapter reading, Sweet Salvation by Toya Richardson. Manuela huddled in a corner of her dank, dark cell. Her body was battered and bruised. Every movement caused her immeasurable amounts of pain. She looked down at her filthy, naked form and shivered. Her innocence taken weeks, or was it months ago? She couldn't really remember. Each day rolled into the next. The sadistic man who held her captive had shown no mercy. So many blood and tissue samples taken, too. Every day she prayed for death, but it never came. If only she could access her powers to shift, she could get away. That ability had been taken from her soon after her imprisonment. A chip implanted at the base of her skull now blocked her powers. Her eagle had retreated so far inside her mind that she wondered if the bird was already dead. Initially, she'd been kept in the main part of the house until it became apparent that she wasn't pregnant. It was the main reason, so she was repeatedly told, for her capture, to breed and create others of her kind. She'd always thought she'd love to be a parent, but was relieved it hadn't happened. A shudder ran through her, memories of the greed and lust in her captor's eyes when she'd been brought to his bedroom for the first time assaulted her. Like a rabid animal, he'd attacked her, ripping the clothes from her body. She tried to fight back, but he was way too strong, and she had no shifter strength to help her retaliate. She threatened him, but he'd laughed in her face. My father will find me, and when he does, he'll kill you. Oh, Manuela, you are so naive. Your father isn't even in the country. He's in the UK, staying with Elias Crane. He doesn't want you or care for you. What sort of father would allow his daughter to run off, only to be captured by his enemies? Manuela screwed up her eyes to prevent her tears from falling. After all this time, she thought they'd dried up. If only she hadn't argued with her father and stormed out of their community just to spite him. The disagreement had been inconsequential, but as normal, her temper had got the better of her, and she defied his order and went away to lead a normal life. Her captor's words about him had hurt her more than she cared to mention. What would make him leave Spain? Perhaps he thought she'd skipped the country and had gone in search of her. Was her mother with him? So many unanswered questions which she could no longer process. Her plan to lead what she thought of as a normal life had worked for a while. She'd found employment in one of the restaurants in a seaside town. It had been good to be doing something different, but her complacency had been her undoing. Her eagles needed to be free from time to time. Late at night, she'd go down to the beach and shift. Flying free over the sea was exhilarating and had also placated her restless ego. She missed flying on the thermals over the mountains where her community lived. On one of her nightly jaunts, she'd been seized by mercenaries. Men who knew what she was. They'd taken her away under cover of night. They hadn't laid a hand on her and would never tell her what would happen to her. She'd been drugged and taken far away from where she lived. Then, one morning, the door to her room had been flung open, and a monster straight from her nightwear stood in the doorway. For the most part, he was human, except for one hand which was gnarled and more like a bear's paw. His eyes were bloodshot, and its canines were long and distended. She reflected on his words to her. Come with me, bitch. I have plans for you, the man growled. With his distended teeth, his words were difficult to comprehend. But by the expression in his eyes as he looked at her body, Manuela knew this would not be good for her. When she stood rooted to the spot, he leapt towards her and slapped her with his human hand. She fell backwards. He grabbed her hair, pulling some of it out by the roots, and dragged her from the room. The horrors were even worse as she left the room. His guards were different to the ones she'd been captured by. These were men. These were very human. These were very different. Some had claws instead of hands, beaks in places of mouths, tails, hooves, fangs. What madness was this? They all eyed her with greed, although the man who grabbed her by the hair seemed to be in charge. His next words chilled her to the bone. This female is mine property, mine to dominate, mine to fuck, and mine to impregnate. No other is to touch her, unless I get bored and decide you can have her. And with those words, her nightmare had begun. Manuela soon learned her captor's name, which struck more fear into her heart. Drake Scott. Part of the Scott Tech, the company who made a living trying to capture supernats like her herself to turn into bioweapons and ultimate soldiers. She had thought they were based in the UK, close to where Elias Crane's protector community was situated. From whispered conversations she'd overheard, the research facility had been destroyed. Some of the guards, who were still fully human, had said Drake had injected himself with a serum containing Supernat's blood and DNA. He'd wanted to be like them. Obviously, it hadn't worked as he planned, although he did possess strength beyond that of a normal human. He'd run to Spain because most of his creations and men had been ripped apart by the Supernats. Apparently, his father, Luther, had died in the fight. This now left Drake in charge. His sanity was questionable at best. No one dared to confront him, though, because his monsters were unswervingly loyal to him. Pain lanced through her body, which continuously throbbed and ached from her wounds. She looked at her breasts covered with scratches and bite marks. The marks where he'd whipped her when she hadn't fallen pregnant covered most of her body. These were infected, melding with all the other pain she endured. When she'd initially been held by him, Manuela had fought him every inch of the way, biting, punching, and scratching. To begin with, it had turned him on, making her pain and suffering worse. As the days turned into the weeks, though, her resolve had faltered. After all the abuse on her mind and body, her fight was gone. Her mind and body broken beyond repair. Please, let me die, she whispered out to the darkness. Then she crawled into a fetal position in an attempt to comfort herself. Drake Scott was frustrated and angered. Manuela had endured rigorous tests by the doctors on her capture. She'd been found to be fertile, her body at the peak of physical health. Then why had she failed to conceive? He couldn't possibly be the one with the problem. But she was of no consequence to him now. His soldiers had tracked down other possible female shifters. With any luck, he'd have them at his disposal soon. It was time he got rid of her. They'd take her numerous samples of her blood and DNA. He fucked her half to death, so there was no need to keep her any longer. A vicious smile curved his lips. He had the perfect ending for this useless shifter bitch, a fitting way for her to go. He buzzed his head of security in. I want you to prepare our newest soldiers and hounds for a hunt first thing in the morning, Smith. The man's eyes widened. Certainly, sir. Where is it taking place, and who will they be hunting? The mountains south of here. But isn't that too close to Morgan's protector community? Drake laughed with delight. That's exactly why I've chosen it. I'm leaving him a present, a warning of what will happen to others of their kind if they're caught. The prey will be his daughter. An evil expression covered Smith's face. And what do we do when we catch her? Drake knew Smith had coveted Manuela from the moment he'd laid eyes on her. You can fuck the life out of her. And then? And then you can let the hounds rip her to bits until her parts little the area. Her father can bury whatever is left of her body. Josh inhaled a deep breath when he left the small private jet they traveled in from the UK to Spain. It was sweltering, the heat hitting him full on. Man, this is way hotter than living in the forest back home, Liam announced behind him. Yeah, but then again, it's always this warm for most of the year in this area. The temperature is always hotter than the UK. Josh watched as an estate car pulled up on the airstrip. An elegant woman stepped out of the passenger side and ran for Morgan. He embraced her and placed a searing kiss on her lips. This must be Christina, Morgan's wife. Whoa, never had Morgan down as a passionate dude. Josh laughed. Liam, you never pay attention to anyone. I pity your poor mate when you find her. Come on, you two, I need a shower, or I'll melt in this heat. Josh rolled his eyes. He wondered why Graydon had even volunteered to go with them. He wasn't the friendliest of people, although he had an idea that Elias might have been behind that decision. Probably hoping this would help him interact with others better. Come on, boys, we have a 3-hour drive and then a hike through forests and the mountains before we get home. All three of them grumbled at Morgan's declaration. It's not that bad. Once we reach the mountains, you may shift if you like. We can have someone pick up your bags for you, Christina informed them. Elias had explained that most protector communities operated in the same way as theirs. Places to hide vehicles and plenty of willing hands to assist with the transportations of clothes and other personal items when required. Christina walked towards them, holding hands with Morgan. Josh noted the expression in Morgan's eyes as he gazed at his wife. The same intensity was there as it was with all mated couples. He thought back to how his parents had shared the same expression. how his father always called her darling just to see the smile on her face and color in her cheeks. Sadness engulfed him. Even after all this time, he missed his parents and sister so much. He would take absolute pleasure in hunting Drake Scott down one day and killing him for what he'd done to his family. And this is Josh, he heard Morgan introduce his wife to him. She enveloped him in a hug. Her body trembled. Christina moved away from him and cupped his face between her hands. Her eyes grew wide and filled with tears, leaving Josh confused. Christina? Christina turned to face her husband. It's him, she whispered. What do you mean by that, my love? She turned back to face Josh. You've come to save our daughter. The door to Manuela's cell flew open. Smith, one of Drake's highest ranking soldiers, stood in the doorway. This man had looked at her with hunger every time he saw her. He was never left alone with her, and for that she was extremely grateful. She expected to see Drake stride inside the room, but there was no sign of him. Her body began to shake. Ice-cold sweat dripped down her back, her breath coming out in short, sharp gasps. Her mind went back to all the abuse her body had been subjected to. A headache gripped her as her fear took hold. He stood directly in front of her, eyeing her body with way too much interest. Almost since her capture, she'd been kept naked as a form of punishment for defying Drake. She'd become accustomed to her nakedness, even when men glanced her way. Now, she really wished she could cover up her body. The bruises, scratches, and lash marks didn't appear to tamp down his lust for her. What are you doing here? She asked with as much defiance as she could. I've come to take you on a little journey into the mountains. His tone sent shivers of fear down her spine. Where's Drake? He knelt down in front of her, his hand grasping for one of her breasts. She slapped his hands away. So many questions. This is what's going to happen, little lady. We are going to sedate you, dump you in some mountains close to where your community is located, and then we are going to hunt you down. Me and some of the boys, he indicated to the failed experiments outside the door, are going to have a little fun with you. And if anything is left afterwards, the hounds are going to rip you to pieces. I'm sure there will be enough for your father to scrape off the ground and bury. Fear engulfed her. Even though she would finally find peace in death, the road to her end was going to be filled with pain. She felt a prick in the side of her neck and then succumbed to darkness.